Globalization, I think that the guest test book just assumes basically that we know what it is. He immediately asks, and why is it important for anthropology? As if we know what it is and why it should be important for anthropology. Now, as several of you have said, it seems to be important for anthropology because in every anthropology class, or at least in ancient civilization, it keeps getting used, also in sociology and some other academic-y type classes. But it's actually, in some ways, the history of this word and how it's been used is very confusing. I'm going to try and sort some of that out in today's class, but I have to say that it confused me a little bit as I was trying to put this together. In part because we got the word globalization, or it first emerged from basically the world of marketing. People who were not necessarily academics, such as the Harvard Business Review. Now, that's obviously associated with Harvard, but was very geared toward marketing and selling products. And they were the first people to popularize this world, people who wanted to sell you things. And so, in the popular view, or at least the way most people assume what globalization is, most people wouldn't associate globalization with ancient civilizations. They'd associate it with something that was around 30 years ago, when the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So you have the dissolution of a number of places that were together under the USSR, the Soviets, who we were fighting in the Cold War, right? So you had Russia, East Germany, Ukraine, all these places that in some cases have become independent, stopped being communist, and that union fell apart. We also had the reunification of Eastern and Western Germany, which had been separate places, one capitalist, one communist, separated by what was called the Iron Curtain. And this was done after World War II, in part because we didn't ever want the Germans to be able to get together again and cause havoc in the same way they had during World War II and World War I. But Germany was put back together again under a more capitalistic economy. People didn't think either of these things would ever happen. We also have the fact that China, although it continues to be politically, it continues to call itself a communist country, and there is a political party, the Communist Party of China, right? But in economic terms, they seem to be producing more and more stuff which they sell into the capitalist world quite happily. So many of our electronic devices, equipment for those electronic devices, as well as all kinds of other stuff, toys and all kinds of goodies we get from China. And so this again is a pretty major shift. But I'm going to call it a glib idea, or just a popular idea that basically the world is getting smaller and smaller. We're all going to be able to talk to each other with these devices and communicate and travel all around the world and be happy together and sell things to each other and be one big happy capitalist place. So this was the happy idea of globalization, which was sold to us by marketing people. This idea took a real hit after September 2001, because the idea that people were simply going to be talking to each other and getting along didn't seem to be true. But for a long time, and perhaps even today, there's this idea that we're just going to have a smaller and smaller world united under capitalism. Now, there was the marketing side of this, but globalization became something that people really thought about in anthropology and in other social sciences like sociology and it trickles into our high school curriculum as well. Because from the marketing slogan, people develop this idea into more what you might call big words for small things. So Guest talks about what people call time-space compression. That sounds like a big thing. It sounds difficult to understand. However, if you just put this into like regular English, what would you call time-space compression? Yeah, it's like, okay, I can talk to people across the world. I can go places faster. Time-space compression, right? It talks about flexible accumulation, the idea of offshoring, so that things are produced in a different country and put together in different places, or outsourcing work to different parts of the world, migration, people moving into different places, and the idea of uneven development. What would that mean? Yeah, so that different places are getting richer and poorer faster. I would also add here that different people within those places, so even within the United States or within, you might call, third world societies, there are pockets of wealth, pockets of great inequality. Now, as some of you noted, social science like anthropology, sociology tends to be a little bit more skeptical about globalization, right? And so the fun version is we're all capitalists, we're all going to get along, everybody's getting closer together, it's a small world, yay. If you study globalization in anthropology or a sociology class, you're likely to get a different approach to the benefits and the disadvantages of this. Now, at one time, there was a ton of readings and writings and literature about globalization. You would have heard about this constantly in college. In fact, when I reflect upon this, my very first class that I taught at Albion College in Michigan in the spring of 2001 was about globalization. So it was everywhere. It was often being taught. And so there was this social science version of globalization. The thing is, anthropology has long had a slightly different take on globalization than some of these other disciplines and some of the more popular approaches. The first thing that I would say is that globalization is much deeper or older than something that happened 30 years ago. And so, in general, as we have already read and talked about in your textbook, anthropology knows that people have always been interconnected, that people have never been isolated from each other. They have always been in trade and in contact and migrating and moving around all throughout human history. However, it is also true that there were certain regions of the world which grew transcontinentally disconnected. For example, the Americas and the Eurasian African continent, Australia. The people in all of those places were connected among themselves, but they weren't really connected to each other. Before, as we know, the transoceanic voyages of Columbus and others, and the tying together of the world into a global trade system in which people, products, things, animals, diseases became moved about the entire globe. So we could consider this to be one of the key moments of globalization occurring 500 years ago, around 1500, when these areas become knotted together. And Guest tells us that anthropology emerged in the mid-19th century during an earlier era of globalization. So we have people being interconnected from a long ago. We have this global moment when people become connected across the globe. And then Guest discusses an earlier era of globalization in the mid-19th century. So let's say 1850 1850s, 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, around there, he calls an era of globalization. So this is on page 21, where he talks about the technological innovations in transportation and communication enabled a period of colonial encounter, the slave trade, and the emerging capitalist economic system. So this is the context in which anthropology is emerging, is in the context of colonialism, emerging capitalism, those kinds of things. Now, you might not get that impression, though, from reading some of those early anthropological works. And I would say, sadly or unfortunately, this early anthropology, say the 1880s through about the 1950s, more or less, often portrayed people as living in these isolated and disconnected little worlds. I put in there the Nakirema because, as you remember, that is in some ways a satire or a spoof of anthropological writing. And if you read the Nakirema without realizing that it's actually about Americans, one of the things it does is portray these people as completely isolated and disconnected from the world around them. Now, we should have known, or those early anthropologists should have known, that this wasn't true, that it wasn't representative of those societies. However, there were perhaps a number of reasons that they desired to portray societies in this way. One of those reasons is that anthropology was trying to capture, anthropologists thought that everybody was going to become westernized or swept up into capitalism. And so anthropology wanted to capture what people were like before that happened. And so, to varying degrees, this turned out to be not as true as they believed it was, but this was the idea that you need to salvage those things that were about to disappear. If you didn't capture them and put them in a museum, they would be gone. Anthropologists also thought that these people who they saw as sometimes a word that we don't want to use today, primitive, could be their equivalent to a laboratory. That you could go to different societies and you could compare them as if they were laboratory specimens, that you could compare them with each other in order to get a sense of the full range of human variation. It's also perhaps more fun and appealing to be an anthropologist when you're playing up the idea that you're studying an exotic people or an exotic custom, and you're the first one to discover these things. Basically, it's more fun to do anthropological fieldwork if you ignore the fact that when anthropologists were first doing their fieldwork, many of the world's societies had become producers of some of the biggest commodities of the Western world. So producers of coffee, sugar on plantations. And so this didn't really become a popular thing for anthropologists to study because it seemed like that was not as exciting as doing more isolated or primitive customs. Now, I put this up there because in the next class, we're going to be doing field work called Making a Cup of Coffee Unfamiliar. And we'll hopefully learn a little bit about where coffee comes from, where it started being produced. But the fact of the matter is that before anthropologists, most anthropologists ever arrived in these places, people had been swept up into a global trade network. Many of them had been ripped from their homes and taken to other places in order to plant, cultivate sugarcane, coffee, tea, all the things that we love so much today, are very much a product of this earlier time. So, how does Guess get around this? The fact that if globalization is 500 years old or 200 years old, or why emphasize it now? And basically what he is saying is that yes, globalization is hundreds of years old, maybe even more, but now it's bigger, it's faster, it's worse. badder and badder, bigger and badder. To me, I would add a note of caution here that it's not always clear that these processes that we talked about, time space compression, are that much newer or larger than they were in, say, the 19th century. Let me talk about a couple examples. For example, immigration and migration. We get all excited about that in today's world, right? Everybody's looking to talk about the border and all these people crossing the border. As of right now, this could change, but as of right now, the percentage of foreign-born people in the United States is less than it was in 1910. So we're not, in terms of percentages, in terms of the percentage of people moving around, we're not where we were 100 years ago. People talk about the border. In the olden days, back in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, there wasn't even a border there. There weren't any walls. You just crossed. You just came back and forth. Nobody cared. I mean, people knew that there was supposed to be a line there. In fact, since 1990 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain, there have actually been more borders, walls, and boundaries erected than during any other period in human history. So it's weird to make the argument that globalization is so much bigger now, when in fact, for certain people, it was easier to move around 100 years ago than it is today. Uneven development, it's hard to argue that that's anything new. Flexible accumulation, producing things in one place which are consumed in another, coffee, sugar, tea, all those things that got moved around. So again, I'm not trying to say there is nothing new in today's world. Obviously, these new devices that enable us to be addicted to things all across the world may make things faster and newer, but we should keep in mind that in percentage terms and the ways in which people were moving around before is not necessarily that much different than it was over 100 years ago. Some people have even asked if we are actually still in an age of globalization. Now, this may sound weird because here we are all doing our electronic stuff, and we have people from all over the world in our classrooms. But please note that in the last 20 years, there has been a huge rise in many different places of the idea of ethnonationalism. That is to say that a nation should ideally be composed of one ethnic group, France for the French. So we saw Brexit, for example, where you had a previous member of the European Union, which might be considered a form of globalization, right? People coming together to form a new form of government. And then you have the Brits saying, nah, we're out. We're going to exit that. And of course, in our own country, we get a little bit hung up with this guy, Donald Trump's rhetoric about immigration, about nationalism, about who belongs here. But it's very important to realize that he is only one part of what is happening in a number of different places. So you have the rise of these movements in France and Germany and Italy, Brazil. Many places around the world have seized upon this idea of ethno-nationalism. As I mentioned, there's an increasing amount of border restrictions. People trying to check documents and build walls and build fences and keep people in and out of different places. This was not necessarily true in the 1930s for different people. I'm not trying to say it was never there, but it wasn't as prominent. A few years ago, The Economist came out with an issue called Globalization, which was trying to argue that in fact, this idea that everything was moving faster and faster in terms of business interconnection was not indicative of the way the world was going. And in fact, we were slowing everything down. Also, we have seen, don't know where this will go, but a divide between the technologies and technological platforms of the United States and China. So you have the world's two largest economies in some ways moving in different directions. Now, we are still linked together, but in other ways, there has been a divide between these two economies. And so some people wonder, I certainly do, if the idea of globalization and everybody got all hyped up about it, was that real or was that simply we all got on board with a fad? And I would say that, although from your world, it seems like people are talking about globalization in your sociology and anthropology classes, it's not as much as it was before. And about 20 years ago, almost every textbook would conclude with the issue of globalization. So I'm trying to say here is that globalization is an interesting idea, but in some ways, the analysis of it or how it was used to describe the world, it got a little ahead of itself in terms of the way people were using it. I will also say that in terms of are we still globalizing, our political situation, at least in the United States, and at least as late as a few months ago, seems to be led by people, well, let me put it to you this way. Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. If you just had to look at these guys, where would you say they live on the globalization continuum? So you have this whole idea of got to keep people out, got to tariff other people, got to put all those tariffs on China, got to the whole idea of America first, demonizing rhetoric against anybody who doesn't look like him, that stuff. But the thing is Biden is basically from the same generation and had some basically kept the tariffs that Trump had before on China, basically kept the immigration restrictions that Trump had put into place, basically, actually, and perhaps more successfully, encouraged American or US manufacturing. US oil drilling is currently at its highest level ever. Yay, US. Wait, that doesn't make you happy, right? So you might say that both of these people came of age during a time of less globalization. I mentioned that the rates of foreign-born people in the United States were highest around 1910, highest percentage, but they were lowest around, say, 1970. So when these guys were coming up in the world, there wasn't as much immigration. Now, time has changed a little bit. As we may know, the presidential race has changed. And what's interesting about Harris as a person and presidential candidate is you may, in some ways, almost say that she embodies globalization. Not necessarily saying that her policies would be different than, say, the Biden administration, but in terms of her biography, an Indian mother meets a Jamaican father in California. That's what globalization was all about. So I would say that in some ways, the fact of the matter is globalization is just part of our lives now. Harris's slogan of we're not going back is perhaps not so much that, but that you can't dial things back. It's the issues that we face are going to be global issues. Now, I first put that these issues are very real because there are some people who are trying to deny all these issues. And in this class, we are going to assume that they are real and that they span the globe. Now, a number of you in your comments mentioned this idea of climate change as one of the things that is most facing us. A lot of people don't like to think about this for good reason. We had a great quote in here. I think this is you on page 26. Whereas our ancestors struggled to adapt to the uncertainties of heat, cold, solar radiation, disease, natural disasters, famines, and droughts, today we confront changes in social forces that we ourselves have set in motion. So a lot of you focused on this, that people have been adaptable and flexible, and that's one of the great things about being people and changing ourselves and modifying our own, at least local environments. But as we know now, the accumulated change threatens to change the whole world, you might say. So it's not that we're adapting to things that are happening in our environment, it's that we have to adapt to an environment that we ourselves have destabilized. This is something that is obviously now not something that can be solved in your local environment. You can pick up all the trash, but you can't control the temperature or the weather that might be creeping in. When COVID-19 first came out, we tried to shut it all down, right? We tried to keep people from traveling around and didn't work so well. So these kinds of diseases, pandemics, health issues are crossing national borders, whether or not people are successful at trying to keep people out of certain countries. Issues of race, a fight for justice is something that we hear about perhaps in the United States, but it's also something that has taken on a global perspective. So back in 2020, you had protests around the world in support of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. Later on, guests didn't even realize how relevant this would be. But on page 126 to 127, you'll see a picture of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, but it's in Gaza City, Palestine. I couldn't take this picture today because I'm not sure what is in Gaza City at this moment. But here it was, and the people there saw their own cause as allied to that of the United States. The issue of native peoples, of indigenous peoples, of the peoples that anthropologists studied the most, you might say, have not disappeared, but are in some ways more important than ever before. So the identification of indigenous peoples in our own country and sovereignty rights in Canada, many places in South America, and around the world, people are arguing for the right to self-determination and autonomy. Reproductive health, reproductive justice, issues of gender, sexuality is something that we see in our own country, but it's something that people are taking votes on all over the world, allied together and fighting over. Of course, migrants and people who don't have a country at all. In fact, in the Olympics, they have a team from people who were basically refugees. I'm making that up. Even won a medal. So people who don't have a flag. What are we going to be able to solve these by looking at each nation and everybody does something in their own country and we'll all be fine? Yeah. So absolutely. You can't really solve these problems on a country by country basis, right? We could, in the United States, let us say we all of a sudden got super environmental and reduced all our carbon emissions to zero. And yeah, I know right now we're drilling more oil than ever. But let's say we reversed all that. If China decides, screw it, we're just going for it, it's not really going to have an effect. So you need to have at least some agreement between these places. Have also been thinking about this, is that the whole idea that you can have an international agreement has also become difficult. And so it is not so much that, again, it's not so much that globalization is progressing or not. It's simply that we have been inextricably tied together in ways that the nation state simply can't handle. And I want to give you a couple examples of what I'm thinking there from other parts of the world, which the whole idea that you can have a country and you have these borders and there's one group of people on one side of the border and another group of people on the other side of the border. There are places where that we can keep that fiction alive, but there's a lot of places where that's become really difficult to understand how it's going to work. So you may have heard about this place called Ukraine, and then it got invaded by Russia. And there's this whole part of Ukraine which is the Crimea, which was already annexed by Russia and is probably never going back to Ukraine. And then there's this whole area of Ukraine, which may or may not become Ukraine again, but is already populated by a lot of people who mostly speak Russian and might want to be there or may not. It's hard to say. And so you have that going on. And so you have these Russian troops still pushing westward. Just today, they fired off some more bombs and stuff. But at the same time, you have the Ukrainians, you may have heard about this, invading part of Russia, capturing some Russian soldiers and messing up this part of the world. And what I'm saying is, it's hard for me to understand how you're going to put all these places and people back together. Like, if we ever get to a situation of peace again, where are people going to go? And so you also have millions of Ukrainians who are now living in Poland and different countries in Europe. It's hard in many parts of the world, not just, this is an obvious and an example that's been very much in the news. It's difficult to imagine how we get back to a bounded nation state with borders and border crossings from this situation. Not impossible, but it's just hard. Or in the West Bank and Gaza, this is actually a map that was published in 2019, so 5 years ago, when this place, the Carnegie Ethics Institute, was already saying that the idea of a two-state solution had already failed. Now, in today's world, this place looks a lot different than it did in 2019. But I would just say that the official United States position and the position of the United Nations is that there should be two states here, that there should be a Israel and a state for Palestinians. But it's difficult to imagine how that's going to work these days because so much has changed on the ground. The official position that there's going to be two separate states, bounded countries there, it's just hard to imagine how that's going to work. Again, I'm not trying to say it can't work. I'm just trying to say that in many parts of the world, the idea that we are going to have one bounded nation state that is going to have one government responding to the things that are going on in its own country is difficult to maintain. Now, what this leads us to is this quote from Guest, which I had you all respond to in various ways. Solving the challenges that face the human race in your lifetime will require greater engagement, interaction, and cooperation, not more isolation and ignorance. I couldn't get anyone to disagree with that quote. In fact, you all seem to agree to various ways, which is probably the hallmark of being in an anthropology class, is you agree with that idea. I could get some different perspectives out of you about if we're making any progress on this, if you're pessimistic about it or optimistic. There were others who highlighted some of the disparities of globalization, that uneven development that we talked about, that in some ways leads to worse outcomes. There were others of you who highlighted how isolation, people who become isolated, either by choice or by being left out of the world political and economic developments, that leads to conflict and bad decisions and a growing sense of problems. So I think that we all, and I do, agree that we are going to need this. Whether we're going to get it is still going to be an open question. Whether we're going to proceed along a path that is greater engagement, interaction, and cooperation. That would be good, and that's what we need, because like I said, I don't think the issues that we face can be confronted on a country by country, community by community basis. We have to work for them, of course, in our own places, localities, states, countries, but we're going to need cross-border, cross-national solutions.